Before we switch to blockchain and all these challenges, can you tell us a little bit more about Hyperledger? What are you guys focused on right now? What are you working on right now?
Sure. So Hyperledger is a part of the Linux Foundation. The Linux Foundation is a 15-year-old nonprofit operating at the center of many of the most important open source projects in the world, right? Obviously the Linux operating system, but also Kubernetes, which is a big part of the cloud computing world, in software-defined networking, in all these different domains. And Hyperledger got started 3 years ago to try to look at distributed ledgers and smart contracts, right? Not necessarily cryptocurrencies in the vein of Bitcoin and Ethereum, but in the integration and the tokenization of a lot of the world's digital assets and real world assets that can be tied to them, and a lot of these multi-participant processes. So we are an open source community. We have corporate members, but all of our software is available to the public and for free without any obligation for people to go and build their own blockchains with.
So which companies do you mostly work with?
So our membership includes companies like IBM and Intel and JP Morgan and a lot of really large companies. In fact, there's about 12 now who offer blockchain as a service using our products. There's another 80 or so companies that offer other products and services on top, from again those kinds of companies to small companies trying to disrupt their industries. And it's a really global phenomenon too. Companies in Russia, actually Sberbank is a member of ours, and startups in Russia and the Ukraine and that sort of place, to Asia. About 40% of our members are based in Asia, and about 20% actually of the total are headquartered in mainland China. So lots of interesting use cases all over the world and lots of interesting participants all over the world.
You've recently partnered up with Ethereum Enterprise Alliance, and what's the goal of this partnership? What are you working on right now together?
So Hyperledger is not one single software piece. It's actually a family of products that actually solve this distributed ledger problem in a couple of different ways. In the same way you have different kinds of databases out there. And one of the products in our suite is an implementation of the Ethereum smart contract language. So smart contracts that can be written for the public Ethereum network, also now, thanks to our work, can run on private networks, on permissioned blockchain networks. And so as the Ethereum community has evolved and kind of professionalized, and many companies have started to get involved there, we felt it was important to build a bridge to that community. And the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance is very focused on standards, and that's very complementary to our focus on open source software. So we felt it was important to find ways to work together, as well as to send a message to the world that it's not Ethereum versus Hyperledger, it's really Ethereum and Hyperledger. And we're trying to really just go and figure out how do we provide as many options to the public as we can.
Which use cases impressed you the most in a recent year or two?
Yeah, well, I'm really a big fan of the supply chain use cases that have to do with bringing a layer of social justice and trying to address some of the real big problems out there in the world. Things like fighting slave labor. So one of the big deployments of Hyperledger Fabric is in the diamond industry, where it's used to trace the provenance of diamonds to ensure that they don't come from mines that employ slave labor, or that were used, from the use of diamonds to purchase weapons or do other illicit activity, right? So that now is the default tracking system for the diamond industry. And nobody should be buying diamonds today unless they can see the verifiable history of that in the diamond blockchain. But the really big use case that energizes a lot of us is around the reinvention of digital identity. Instead of this Facebook model where everything important and interesting about you is on this remote server controlled by Mark Zuckerberg, instead, let's think about a world where all of your private information, all of the things that define you, are held close to you in something that feels and looks like a wallet, and which you can share with different sites, you can share with different people, but you can also pull back, and you have the control to pull that back. And that's how we get to not only a better way to do social networks, it's also how we get to passports and driver's licenses and diplomas and healthcare records. It's just a much better way to manage this. And blockchain technology is essential to being able to give consumers a sense of agency over that. And we have a big project at Hyperledger focused on digital identity.
I recently met ex-Prime Minister of Estonia, Taavi Rõivas, who has put the whole country on digital identity. I mean, they have digitalized everything, like voting, healthcare, and electronic identity is their main thing. Can these things coexist together? digital identity based on blockchain and smart contract, and electronic identity already existing?
Yeah, well, I think there are a lot of countries that have pursued digital IDs, but they pursued it in a very centralized way. The biggest example of this is the government of India, which has a massive system called Aadhaar, which has now granted its 1.3 billion citizens with a digital identity. The problem is when you centralize it, you make it a really big honeypot for hackers, and when you centralize it, you also put too much value in being an administrator of that database. And so there have been a lot of compromises, a lot of weaknesses discovered in this, and in fact the Supreme Court in India has ruled against the use now of the Aadhaar system for a lot of important processes because it cannot be trusted. And so reinventing that through a distributed digital identity, through something where instead of it being a central directory, it is in the form of essentially the digital equivalent of a passport, something given to you. We can solve a lot of those problems. And now countries from Canada to the government of Sierra Leone to the Philippines are all looking and doing pilots in this space, and many more than that, and trying to understand how this works. But but I'm really optimistic this is how we reinvent how digital identity works.
So you work with governments, Hyperledger?
We do. We have relationships with government agencies in the U.S. and Canada and in the U.K., as well as in Asia and pretty much all over. We feel that there's an educational role that we can play, but there's also a capacity building role, right? Many countries took a while to understand how open source works, and now some countries have open source software development and supporting open source as a primary kind of goal. Now we feel the same type of education and capacity building has to happen around blockchain technology.
So I know that Hyperledger aims at educating enterprise businesses, making them realize the benefits of blockchain technology, right? But what will it take for a consumer to finally see and to understand the impact of blockchain? This wallet thing?
Sure. Well, I think in many cases these technologies will be deployed and consumers won't even know about it, right? They'll know, hey, they are buying a diamond at a diamond store, and if it's moderately sized diamond or larger, they'll have an app that shows them here's where the diamond came from, and here's all the signatures from all the places it handed off, so you can have a high confidence that when the jeweler says this is really from this mine in South Africa, it really came from there. Or their medical records will be more portable, right? Or when they apply for a loan, they'll have a lower rate that they pay because their credit history is verifiable and they're easily verifiable, right? So in many ways it'll be invisible, but I believe it'll help with a lot of these bureaucratic processes. The digital identity part is where it perhaps will be most visible to them. They might still not call it blockchain. It might simply be called your ID wallet, right? But this will give people, I think, finally a sense of control and sovereignty and agency over their digital data.
Some of major players of the crypto market, I'm talking about cryptocurrencies, not the blockchain technology, they tend to say that the next wave of mass adoption of blockchain will be seen mostly in developing countries rather than in developed countries, like, for example, in Philippines, right? Yeah. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, and some parts of it might be thanks to cryptocurrency. I think a large part of it will be due to those countries adopting these same technologies, even for non-cryptocurrency applications. So in the Philippines, for example, the banking industry is building a user-centric KYC system. So users can share when they apply for a loan from one bank their history of transactions with other banks, right? And kind of puts them in the center of that rather than like a behind-the-scenes credit history, credit reporting bureau kind of thing. Right, and so this is something that will increase financial inclusion. It'll bring down the cost of borrowing in the Philippines, and that's one example. But I think even to the refugee camp example, even to the countries that are at the poorest point. So, for example, the government of Sierra Leone is working with a nonprofit called Kiva to implement a digital identity system for all 30 million citizens in Sierra Leone, and this is using a technology that does not have a central vendor, does not have a central directory, right? And the only way that they could go and deploy this stuff at a reasonable price without creating a big dependency on a vendor is through blockchain technology. So I agree with a lot of that advocacy around this. It's not magic pixie dust though, and just as important as developing the software and great open source software, sharing it widely, and avoiding anything, I think, specific to a token or specific to a vendor. We also need to do education and capacity building and make sure there are developers all around the world who understand how to work with this stuff, the way that they understand how to work with the internet today.
which also brings us to the question of regulation, right? What do you think should happen in the regulatory field in the next 2 or 3 years in order for us to see this like relatively mass adoption?
Yeah. I think regulators matter quite a bit to the reinvention of certain kinds of financial assets digitally, such as equities, as security tokens, right? I think we'll see a lot of the equities markets move to using distributed ledgers as the essential backbone to trade a lot of these equities. I think we need to recognize that regulators didn't just materialize out of thin air, for the sake of bureaucracy. They materialized because in many cases there were famous examples of people taking abuse of other people's confidences and selling them things that were perhaps not really what was claimed. And so I think the industry needs to work with regulators, as I've seen them do, to educate them, but also recognize that there are reasonable kind of rules and guidelines and probably regulations that in each sector, whether it's equities or mortgages or currencies or any type of like financial instrument, where there's a balancing act to strike.
A lot of fuss about this dot-com boom. Traditionally, comparing...
From 2000?
Yes, traditionally surrounds crypto comparing .com from 2000 from early 90s, right?
Sure.
Do you think this comparison is actually fair? Is that true?
I think we go through waves with every technology cycle of irrational exuberance, right? Of this kind of excitement, and certainly there were a lot of new millionaires and billionaires minted from people who were early adopters of Bitcoin and who participated in the Ethereum ICO. One of the more famous examples, even just recently, is the gentleman who bought $170 million worth of real estate in Nevada, and this is the Blockchains LLC company doing a crypto utopia out there. So I think that kind of investment it allows us to do a lot of very high risk things, which it could turn out to be amazing and cool, right? But there'll be a lot of failures there. And it's important not to blame an entire system for very noteworthy failures when there's also some noteworthy successes, right? And I think every technology movement needs these kind of boom-bust cycles to incentivize high-risk investment to get really amazing things to come out. So I don't think it's a bad thing, but I think investors should be very wary of claims. And smart investing makes sense anyways, right? Like when you invest in a startup, you want to build a relationship with the startup founder. You don't just want to throw money at them and then walk away. And if you're a startup founder, you want to build a relationship with your investors. And the kind of ICO model took that away. It said there should be almost no relationship there. The good news is a lot of that early wealth has now helped fund a lot of technology development, and that will pay off for the next 10 years.
My last question is a little bit tricky. It's about your words about proof of work consensus. Yep. About its death, right? Okay. About you saying it's being dead. So,
it's clearly not dead yet.
Yes, I know, but can you explain why you wish the consensus to be dead?
I think Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever she is, deserves a lot of credit for having or he. What I want to presume it's a she.
Because I recently started to interrupt you because we met Brock Pierce a couple months ago at the blockchain summit, and he said Satoshi Nakamoto is female. That was his words. I
think we should assume it's he or she.
Both options.
Both options are equally valid.
Yes.
So I think she deserves a lot of credit for coming up with a brilliant way to implement a sense of fairness across a network. And that sense of fairness is one CPU, one vote, right? On the premise that we have approximately proportionate access to CPU power based on our wealth, right? And it's one way to fight the Sybil attack problem, pretending to be 1,000 people on the internet when you're actually only one person, right? But that has validity in an anonymous context, right? And most commerce is not conducted in an anonymous context. It's conducted in a world where even if you and I don't directly know each other, we're both a part of the either the same country we live in or the country we're doing business in, or we're part of the same industry, and we actually have reputations that we want to build. And in that kind of setting, you don't need that. It's really over-engineered, right? You don't need the complexity and especially the CPU power churn that comes from that. And I think for many people sat out the Bitcoin revolution and partly are sitting out the Ethereum revolution because it has this sense of being an industry that doesn't care about the environment, doesn't care about its environmental impact, and that's something that industry really needs to address. And the fastest way to address that is to move beyond proof of work to other consensus mechanisms as soon as they can. And I think we'll look back on it as something like mercury mining, where in the mid 19th century, the use of mercury to separate gold from raw ore was like alchemy. Like if you were a technologist, a geek, that was like the coolest way to get to gold, right? But now we live with this terrible toxic legacy in the Sierra Mountains from the use of mercury, where it stunted people's growth and their mental capabilities, and we now recognize how horrible that was. It wasn't worth all the gold that we pulled out, right? So I think we might need to look at proof of work the same way.
Thank you. Sure. Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure meeting you.
Bye.